driving domestic growth and resilience through deregulation. Lowering the cost of business through deregulation will make a significant contribution to accelerating economic growth and employment amidst unprecedented global challenges. Lowering the cost of business through deregulation. It will be over 6 months since the last economic survey when you lay your hands and cast your eyes on this document and this preface. In theory, there should not be much to write in this preface given the short time lapse between since the last survey. In reality, there is. The world is perhaps evolving much rapidly, more rapidly than we realize. In the long span of history, this is par for the course, but we will leave that contemplation for another occasion. 24 was a year of elections. Three big democracies went in for elections: India, America, and Indonesia. India retained the incumbent to the office for the third term. The ruling party continued in Indonesia with a different leader at the helm. In America, there was a change in the presidency. The new president has been in office for less than 2 weeks now. The world had an early inkling of policy changes that will affect the global movements of goods and labor. Europe faces both political and economic uncertainties. Europe's biggest economic engine, Germany, experienced economic contraction for 2 successive years. Policy uncertainty too is a factor since elections are due to be held in February this year. France has had a political uncertainty due to developments in the wake of snap elections called there. The United Kingdom had a change of government. After a long gap, the Labour Party came into office amidst fiscal pressures and slowing economy. In general, Europe is facing competitiveness pressures amidst much higher energy costs, caused in part by the transition towards renewable energy. To a large extent, these developments have affected the global economy. The index of global economic activity of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas has been volatile since the pandemic began, slowing at the end of 2023. The index of global economic activity. The reopening of Chinese economy after COVID shutdown has not led to spurt in economic growth as overcapacity and financial strains in the real estate sector have come to the fore. Due to weak aggregate demand, the economy is in deflationary mode. The absence of significant policy stimulus to boost domestic consumption means excess capacity spills into the external markets. Chinese exports are thriving. China's trade surplus in 24 was nearly 1 trillion US dollars. China's trade surplus in 24 was nearly 1 trillion US dollars. China's trade surplus was nearly 1 trillion US dollars. Recent strength in the US dollar and rethinking in the Federal Reserve about the path of policy rates in America have caused emerging market currencies to weaken. Fiscal strains and low real rates relative to history have led to rapid erosion of value in some currencies compared to others. Borrowing costs for sovereigns are also rising as financial markets reevaluate the outlook for inflation, policy rates, and fiscal prudence. Several stock markets worldwide are at elevated levels and do not appear unduly concerned about economic growth and earnings uncertainties, nor have financial stability risk faced, even though serious concerns are re emerging about securitization, leveraged loans, and private credit. Based on several metrics, current valuation and sentiment levels in the US stock market may be the most extreme or among the top three. Several stock markets are at elevated levels and do not appear unduly concerned about economic growth and earnings uncertainties, nor have financial stability risk faced investors, even though serious concerns are re-emerging about securitization, leveraged loans, and private credit. Based on several metrics, current valuation and sentiment levels in the US stock market may be the most extreme or among the top three. In his report, The Future of European Competitiveness, Mario Draghi wrote, the EU has also benefited from a favorable global environment. World trade burgeoned under multilateral rules, the safety of the US security umbrella, freed up defense budget to spend on other priorities. In a world of stable geopolitics, we had no reason to be concerned about rising dependencies on countries we expected to remain our friends, but the foundations on which we built are now being shaken. The previous global paradigm is fading. The era of rapid world trade growth looks to have passed, with EU companies facing both greater competition from abroad and lower access to overseas market. Greater competition from abroad and lower access to overseas markets. This is the global backdrop for India as it seeks to steady and sustain the growth momentum that the economy has experienced post COVID. The passing of the era of rapid world trade growth clouds the outlook for India's export growth because historically India's export growth has been high beta play on global export growth. This means domestic growth levers will be relatively more important than the external ones in the coming years. The report on European competitiveness could easily have been written for India. Most of the challenges cited therein apply to India, except that India is an aspiring nation and the European continent has the cushion of higher per capita income. Europe is by and large aging, but India has the most youthful demographic profile. That is an advantage, but it comes with a huge responsibility. One of the refrains of the Draghi report is the China challenge to European competitiveness. It is no less for India. Several commentators have recently written about manufacturing colossus that China has become in the last 6 years. Manufacturing colossus that China has become in the last 6 years. India faces limitations in producing critical goods at a scale and quality required to serve the infrastructure and investment needs of the aspiring economy. For instance, India has low production capacity in the solar energy sector for key components like polysilicon, ingots, and wafers. Production capacity for of monocrystalline silicon ingot is expected to quintuple by 2025 from 2 gigawatt in 2023, but it won't be enough to meet the demand in the country. Several solar equipment manufacturers in the country significantly depend on Chinese supply chains and related services. The single source concentration risk is in several product area exposes India to potential supply chain disruptions, price fluctuations and currency risk. India's task is cut out. It means going all out to attract, promote, and facilitate further domestic and foreign investment that India needs to become competitive and innovative economy. It will not be easy because competition for investment is not only with other emerging economies but advanced economies too, who are determined to keep their businesses at home, equally investing in and strengthening domestic supply chain capability and resilience will be hallmarks of strategic and long-term thinking on part of the private sector. Alternative sources of supply where possible have to be located and nurtured, going beyond short-term cost considerations. Another priority related to the above that calls for a collaborated and careful approach is climate change and energy transition. Public policy will have to recognize the role of energy security and energy affordability in enhancing and maintaining competitiveness. It means forging India's own path to energy transition and diversification away from fossil fuels. In this regard, electric mobility makes economic sense in a country which imports most of its oil and has abundant renewable energy and coal. However, it raises important challenges that needs addressing. The import intensity of e-vehicle production, especially from countries with whom India has persistent and large trade deficits, is very high. The extent to which electric mobility is incentivized in the short term needs to keep this factor in mind. Electric mobility makes more economic sense which imports most of its oil and has abundant renewable energy and coal. तो इलेक्ट्रिक मोबिलिटी सेंस भी बनाता है क्योंकि वैसे भी हम सारा ऑयल तो इम्पोर्ट ही करते हैं और हमारे पास रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी की कोई कमी और तो है नहीं. So, however, it raises important challenges that needs addressing. Import intensity of e-vehicle production, especially from countries with whom India has persistent and large trade deficits, is very high. The extent to which electric mobility is incentivized in the short run needs to keep this factor in mind. The import intensity of the e-vehicle production. The extent to which electric mobility is incentivized in the short run needs to keep this factor in mind. Indigenizing the technology and raw materials for electric mobility is an urgent task. Indigenizing the technology and raw materials for electric mobility is an urgent task. Finally and importantly, given India's vast size and limited land availability, public transportation is more efficient alternative for viable energy transition. Therefore, national level policies and local nudges must promote and facilitate its use, going beyond the focus on tailpipe emissions of private transportation choices. National level policies and local nudges must promote it and facilitate its use, going beyond the focus on tailpipe emissions of private transportation choices. It will also require appropriate skilling and education for India's youth to take advantage of technological advances such as artificial intelligence, enabling its population to stay one step ahead of technological developments that would minimize or even eliminate the potential adverse impact of employment, if possible, turn it into force for augmenting employment. It would require a departure from business as usual for collaboration between academic institutions and businesses. Innovation should be facilitated through resource flows, setting up centers of excellence in different technologies, and expanding autonomy for academic and research institutions to attract top talent from the rest of the world to India. Policy action on this front is already underway, with recent budgets reflecting a clear focus on technology driven economy. This includes establishing artificial intelligence centers of excellence at top institutions across India, an announcement of 1 lakh crore financing corpus to catalyze private sector innovation and R&D in sunrise sectors. एक तो अप्रोप्रिएट स्किलिंग एंड एजुकेशन चाहिए इंडिया के यूथ के लिए एडवांसेस सच एज आर्टिफिशियल टेक्नोलॉजी के फील्ड में that would minimize or even eliminate the potential adverse impact on employment and if possible turn it into a force of augmenting employment. It would require a departure from business as usual for collaboration between academic institutions and businesses. Innovation should be facilitated through research flows, setting up of centers of excellence in different technologies and expanding autonomy for academic and research institutions to attract top talent and rest of the world to India. Artificial intelligence centers for excellence collaborate at top educational institutions. An announcement of 1 lakh crore financing to corporates to catalyze private sector innovation and R&D in sunrise sectors. Achieving competitiveness will be an incomplete project without raising productivity in the private sector. As we wrote in Economic Survey 23-24, agriculture sector needs to be freed, empowered and emboldened to diversify away from water dependent crops. Agriculture sector needs to be freed, empowered, and emboldened to diversify away from water-dependent crops. Simultaneously, irrigation cover needs to rise. Agriculture research will need a leg up. Much more can be done. Farmer support policies can benefit from perusal of the report that the OECD put out in November. Above all, underpinning specific policy efforts will have to be the philosophical approach to governance. Getting out of the way and allowing businesses to focus on their core mission is a significant contribution that governments around the country can make to foster innovation and enhance competitiveness. The most effective policies governments, union and states in the country can embrace is to give entrepreneurs and households back their time and mental bandwidth. That means rolling back down regulations significantly. That means vowing and acting to stop micromanaging economic activity and embracing risk based regulations. That means changing the operating principle of regulations from guilty until proven innocent to innocent until proven guilty. Adding layers of operational conditions to policies to prevent abuse makes them incomprehensible and regulations needlessly complicated, taking them further from their original purpose and intents. Getting out of the way is not easy for societies that are still structured around communities, groups, and kinship. These societies are largely hierarchical in nature. Various institutional forces propelled in Western societies to go out and build relations with strangers. This process started as early as the first millennium. As, as a start, as a result, dealing with strangers and building networks and communities with them became necessary. Scale became inevitable and easier. One has to trust to deal with and form relationships with strangers. Written contracts formed the basis of such trust, and other institutional developments followed. However, in close knit and kinship based communities such as India, the trust quotient is still high within but low without. That inhibits scale. The low trust quotient also gives rise to elaborate verification, compliance, and reporting requirements. Further, by and large, hierarchical societies are not made for disruption, change, and innovation, but for maintaining the status quo. Even in such societies and places and industries where this pattern is broken, innovation, competitiveness, and scale emerge. The information technology sector and the startup ecosystem that emerged in Bengaluru in the 90s are the examples. But get out of the way and trust people. We must, for we have no other choice. Business as usual carries the a risk of economic growth stagnation, if not economic stagnation. Yes, trust is a two-way street, and the non government actors in the economy have to indicate the trust reposed. In fact, quite a significant chunk of the complicated compliance requirements stems from the efforts of businesses wanting to keep out of domestic and foreign competition to the detriment of other industries and economy. Nonetheless, wiping out trust deficit in the country is imperative, and government agencies have to set an agenda in this regard. Then it is a good bet that Indian public will overcome the challenges and turn them into opportunities on the way to Viksit Bharat by 2047. One crucial aspect of the low trust without is that practices and policies that evolve in Western societies may be inapplicable and unlikely to succeed in India. India has to choose its own path suited in its context and history. While every chapter of the economic survey makes a case for simplification and deregulation wherever possible and necessary, it also acknowledges areas where more or appropriate regulatory intervention may be necessary. For example, it is reasonable to expect that financial regulators hold themselves to the same standards as they expect of the regulated entities. At the same time, in the chapter on monetary and financial sector developments, we also caution against the risk of financialization and asset price bubbles that we are not endemic to the West. This is why some measures India's regulators took to rein in excessive and financially ruinous speculation for investors were necessary, not just for systemic stability, they were welfare measures in effect. Similarly, if India were to realize the vast potential for its youthful population, their mental, emotional, and physical health needs to be nurtured. Scientific evidence abounds that the consumption of ultra processed foods high in fat, salt, sugar, or HFSS is a big factor in undermining both physical and mental health. In this regard, globally, self regulation has been ineffective. Stringent front of the pack labeling rules are needed and to be enforced. It is not an exaggeration to suggest that countries' future growth potential rides a lot on this measure. According to WHO report published in 23, India's consumption of ultra processed food shot up about $900 million in 2000, $900 million in 2006 to $37.9 billion in 2019. That is an annual compounded growth rate of over 33%. It is unclear if India has a clear front of the pack labeling stipulations for the HFSS food. In the Economic Survey 23-24, in the chapter on social sectors, we focused on the impact of screen time and ultra processed foods on children. This time, the chapter examines the impact of world culture, lifestyle, and eating habits on mental health. There are some areas where the state has to step in. At the same time, when it comes to higher education, the chapter posits that implementation of national education policy is held back by regulations that are supposedly voluntary but effectively mandatory. Further, Further, the chapter dwells into policy priorities for women, farmers, youth, and poor. Facilitating their productive and enhanced participation in economy is the litmus test of inclusive development policies. Investment in education, skill, and physical and mental health will be the focus of youth of both genders. The poor will be provided targeted support to improve their livelihoods and opportunities to move from the periphery to the center of economic activity. It is about finding pathways for advancing their income and living standards through empowerment. For women, governments around the country will have to eliminate legal and regulatory hurdles that hold back their participation in the labor force, besides undertaking facilitative measures. In other words, governments must get out of the way of women joining the workforce. The chapters on industrial and sector and employment and skill development bat for deregulation to boost capital formation and accelerate employment and output growth. In particular, the chapter on industries notes that positive correlation between states that score on ease of doing business parameters and level of industrial activity. States that aspire to raise their industrialization quotient know what they need to do. At the same time, the chapter celebrates the success story of production linked incentive scheme in air conditioners, which is a store successful indigenization through government intervention. The chapter on external sector development wades into the challenges that India will face in the near future, such as threat of restrictive trade policies and the European Union has initiated in the name of avoiding carbon leakage and saving the forest of the world. These have the potential to restrict India's exports and widen the current account deficit at this time when the net foreign direct investment is declining because of successful exits by foreign investors, incentives given by many governments for investments to stay onshore, and higher interest rates in hard currencies. Therefore, chapters raises the question whether India's India's sustainable current account deficit is lower than previously estimated. That has implications for capital formation and investment efficiency or lowering the incremental capital output ratio. In that sense, this chapter provides a neat seek for domestic issues covered in the later chapters. The special essay on artificial intelligence and its implications for employment generation is a brave attempt on our part to put forward some hypothesis on whether the technology will be hugely or adversely disruptive to employment. It suggests that we'll all suggest with all humility tentatively that some of the fears might be misplaced. The chapter does not answer the question of whether the problems that the world faces need a technological solution such as artificial intelligence. Technologists would scoff at such question that would counter that technology evolves during the creative ingenuity of humans and that applications follow. Further, rapid aging in some societies was perhaps a welcome development for them. It may not be so in all for all countries, particularly for labor-rich country like India. Therefore, policymakers in those countries have to question whether AI is necessary. If the answer is clear, it warrants closer scrutiny of its cost and benefits with necessary follow-up action. Even in countries where AI may fill the shrinking labor force, AI's enormous demand for water and electricity is slowly coming into view, much to the bewilderment of policymakers. Therefore, whether the world is better or worse off with AI is not easily answered now. The topic of climate change and energy transition as well as international implications and linkages, as prominently in the last couple of editions of the economic survey. It is no different this time. The topic will be with us for at least another decade or so. This is another area where government is front and center, and the private sector will be somewhat peripheral since public goods are not the private sector's priority. Globally, strong evidence is emerging that high and rising dependence on intermittent sources of power, high energy costs are strongly correlated. Indeed, casualty is like running from the former to the latter and is one of the causes of the rapid and deep slide in industrial production in Germany, as industries citing higher energy costs relocate to other places. Research notes that firm low carbon resources, including nuclear power, bioenergy, and natural gas plants that capture CO2, help save the cost of lowering carbon emission of electricity generation. Without these resources, costs rise rapidly as CO2 limits approach zero. While global warming warrants energy transition, as Professor Mike Home Pithley titled in his book, Climate Change Isn't Everything. As we noted earlier in this preface, and it is time to conclude it, energy transition plans must be mindful of the geopolitical vulnerabilities and avoid deepening India's dependence on external sources for critical imports. Strategic thinking in is warranted. The two obsessions of the West, water and the power guzzling AI and energy transitions, do not set well with each other. One has to give. It appears to be latter because the more the West goes for the wind and solar in its energy mix, the greater the coal consumption in China. The link between the two runs as follows: the requirement for critical minerals and rare earth rises with the share of renewable energy in the overall energy consumption. China dominates production or processing of these materials. Processing requires cheap power, otherwise, these inputs would be costlier, making energy transition even more expensive for Europe than it already is. Cheap power is only possible with coal fired thermal plants. So, both are two sides of the same coin, wrote Ed Conway. This complex interplay makes one thing clear for India: it has to focus a lot more than it has so far on adaptation than on emission mitigation. That is the focus on climate and environment. The fifth and first and fifth chapters deal with near-term and medium-term outlooks for the Indian economy. The first chapter deals more than it normally does on global developments and the risk factors. That is as it should be given the state of the world. Medium-term outlook is an elaborate examination of several of the issues this preface touches upon, and therefore needs to get the domestic economic engine purring to purring by pulling all levers of deregulation. As is the tradition with all economic survey, the first chapter gives our outlook for the real economic growth rate for financial year 25-26. I'm not going to reveal it here and stop you from flipping the pages further. You can see the number at end of the first chapter. Philosophy behind the growth projection is consistent with the philosophy that the government and Ministry of Finance have adopted in the last 5 years with respect to fiscal goals. Be realistic and strive harder to do better than that. Stellar progress in bringing public finances on track in this period is vindication of this approach. This edition does not deal with state capacity issues. The previous edition did so. Demand for state capability and capacity to respond to these developments and make progress on social and economic indicators amid rising geopolitical conflicts will be unlike anything we have experienced since independence, meeting that demand is a priority above all else. Indian economy is on a steady growth path. Macroeconomic health checklist looks good as the country aims to accelerate its economic growth rate in coming years. It has the tailwind of strong balance sheets in the domestic, corporate, and financial sectors. But globalization is on retreat, hence, raising the growth average in the next 2 decades will require reaping the demographic dividend through deregulation stimulus. At the Spartans apparently believed, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. Economic survey is all about that. Would like to believe. So we would like to believe. I hope this preface has given you a flavor of the economic survey and whetted your appetite to know more about what it packs between the pages. I am responsible for the views expressed and the errors, if any, committed in this document. Please let us know what you think of the former and point out the latter. We promise to get better at each outing. As always, putting it and pulling it all together is the labor and love, and a yagna, making the changes happen in reality, is sadhana. So that's all. See you in the next one.